and President Ramaphosa in Parliament this afternoon. It's a reply to a debate on his big economic recovery plan, and we're going to preview that now as we are joined by, let me just see who the economist is that we've got lined up. Siya Biniza, good afternoon to you, and a very warm welcome. First of all, I'm wondering if you can summarize cogently for me what exactly the plan entails. It seems to me that we have a surfeit of plans in the country, but little in terms of implementation.
Sure. Look, I would definitely agree. And there are many people who have critiqued the plan for not being clear in terms of deadlines, not being clear in terms of implementation plans, etc. But I think overall, the gist of the plan is an infrastructure-led approach to the economic recovery. And what government's really targeting is a big number of 1 trillion rand, which is equivalent to about $61 in current exchange rate, or around 17% of GDP in terms of new infrastructure. Of course, that infrastructure is not going to only be financed by government, but going to be financed through primarily public-private partnerships, or trying at least to leverage on private capital. So in a nutshell, really the plan is gearing towards implementing infrastructure to the tune of around 1 trillion rand. And the idea is that this infrastructure will create jobs and create opportunities, and in a way ignite South Africa's economic recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic.
I'm hearing the words trying to a lot in that answer that you've given us. The reality of the situation is that we're still waiting for firm commitment and money in the bank, aren't we?
Oh, precisely, and I think this is also linked to the current fiscal climate that government finds itself in. I mean, a lot of critiques around the response that we've had to the COVID-19 pandemic, and as the plan rightfully states, government had initially earmarked 100 billion rand, which is equivalent to 1.7% of GDP, towards creating jobs and supporting small businesses through the COVID-19 pandemic. This is paling if you compare ourselves to the response elsewhere. Obviously, bigger, larger, and wealthier countries have had much more of an impact through their fiscal spending, and really this is where governments can actually make an impact in terms of economic recovery. The US, for example, spending around 11% of its GDP, but if you compare ourselves with our BRICS partners, Brazil spending around 12%, Russia 3%, India 7%, all of these numbers are way above what we have committed at less than 2% of GDP, which shows that this is likely an inadequate response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and it is as a result of the constraints that governments find itself. Obviously now moving forward, the plan of the 1 trillion rand is going to depend on whether government can resuscitate an interest in government debt from the private sector, but also resuscitate a confidence that government will be able to implement its infrastructure plan. The plan in itself, I think, is a start, but we need to see other areas of government being galvanized towards this, such as the review of state-owned enterprises to support this infrastructure plan, and also in terms of law enforcement. Recently, we've seen government trying to reach out or trying to allow the law to take its place for those who've been found wanting due to PPE, corruption, and others. But still, we haven't seen a cent in terms of monies that have been recovered. If you compare South Africa to Angola, for example, which over the last 2 years has recovered close to $9 billion from corruption previously, this shows that there's still a lot more government work that government must do in order to resuscitate a confidence in the plan and galvanize private capital behind itself. Jeremy?
You're talking about galvanizing people in terms of leadership. Does that mean that we need better or new people around the cabinet table? Is there a deficit when it comes to that type of urgent leadership that you're referring to?
I think definitely. I think domestically there has been a significant challenge, and I partly place this to the challenges of the ANC deployment strategy, which doesn't necessarily put the most qualified or the best people on the job, but rather those with political alliances, obviously, with the ruling party. Yes, this is acceptable, but I think we need to find much more professionalization around the public sector. Same thing with the public enterprises. And I think really the leadership role of South Africa, beyond just ourselves as a country, extends to the region. Of course, this is why the economic recovery of South Africa is critical, because we account for 51% of the SADC GDP, SADC being the Southern African Development Community. And if you look at the next top 5 countries, you're talking Angola, Tanzania, DRC, and Zambia. collectively we account for 84% of SADC GDP, which means really the recovery not only in the country but the region as a whole relies primarily on South Africa and a few other countries getting it right in order to enable the region to find itself on a recovery path. And given the expectations of a second wave to hit our traditional markets in North America as well as Europe, this means that African countries, and particularly SADC as well, will have to rely much more strongly on their own interactions in terms of economic recovery, trading with one another, trying to set ourselves back again in order to implement the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, which has since been delayed up to 2021 in terms of its implementation. So really, South Africa is playing a leading role, and I think the leadership issues are not just contained nationally, but also have a regional impact in how the region recovers.
Siya Biniza, simplify this for me. Over the past couple of days, we've heard a lot of verbiage around this plan. What's right with it? What's wrong with it? As a leading economist, what is the one thing that you'd like to hear this afternoon?
Sure. Look, the one thing that I would like to hear is perhaps a feedback on the existing promises that the president's made in terms of the youth employment summit of a couple of years back, in terms of the previous summits on infrastructure and what those have yielded. At this point, really, we're not necessarily looking for new plans from government, but a confidence that government can actually implement the plans effectively in order to get private capital behind the plan and backing the plan, and also taking a stake. Obviously, this $1 trillion rand target that government is going for in terms of infrastructure delivery is not going to come from the fiscal coffers. It's definitely going to be primarily driven by private capital. And then again, in addition to a report back and trying to get confidence on implementation, it would really help for government to have a few sectors and a focus on our exporting sectors in terms of the economic recovery, which I think is currently not there in the plan, but obviously we'll see as more details come out in this afternoon's discussions regarding what exactly the president has in mind.
And that starts at 3 o'clock this afternoon. Siya Biniza, thank you very much indeed. Economist and Executive Director at Political Economy Southern Africa.